So tonight we are in the lab with Top Gear's very own Richard Hammond as we look at his game show called Richard Hammond's Blast Lab. The game show aired from 2009 to 2011 for 4 seasons, with 52 episodes being made. The show involves 2 teams of 3 children, the red and yellow teams, as they take part in science-related challenges to win prizes. So now that we have the background, let's take a look at a couple of episodes. First up we have Season 1 Episode 1. Okay, so we get some lab rat tapping the camera as Richard tells him the fuse box is underneath, so the lab rat goes to fix it but it goes wrong and there is an explosion. Richard grabs his coat as he heads into the studio, the kids cheer. Richard explains what is about to go down on the show as he says the experiments are a little dangerous. We then get a preview of what is coming up on the show. So the crowd roar as Richard talks about the guards around the studio but says all the guards are invisible, so that isn't very good. He then introduces his ninja Nan instead. She strolls in as she shows off her moves. Richard talks a lot of rubbish as Ninja Nan heads to the security place as she attacks the lab rat from earlier. So after all of that nonsense, we finally meet the yellow team as they introduce themselves. One of them blows the trombone as Richard is impressed. They come into the studio as we then meet the red team. One of the kids counts to 30 in Spanish as Richard lets them into the studio. Richard shows the teams to their seats as he then talks about his car Oliver. He explains he fitted it with some sort of fact nav. He explains the rules as this is round 1, it is basically a true or false quiz. So it is Reds go first as they have to figure out whether adults have less bones than children. They go for false as they get it wrong as Richard explains that bones fuse together. The Yellows have a go as Richard says the Earth is completely round. The Yellows go false as they get it right. I'm shocked at this news as Richard then asks how many seconds in a year as both teams try to get as close as possible to the right answer. Richard shows off his plant microphone as he asks the audience. The red team get the closest as it is 1-1 at the end of the first round. So time for mini science now as the teams will use household objects to create science. We get introduced to Mini Miss who is Richard's old science teacher. I don't know how that works, but whatever. Richard says he used a time machine to bring her to the studio but things went bad and that's how she became a kid again. So Richard asks what they are going to do today as Mini Miss explains what they are going to do. Richard talks nonsense as Mini Miss continues to explain as she shows off the balloon going across the washing line. Mini Miss goes to help the teens as Richard explains the science behind the balloon as he talks about Newton and his third law. So Richard starts the game as it is a straight race. The teams go for it as they rush to get the balloon across the line. The crowd cheer as the teams continue to build. The Yellows win the race as Richard calls time. The Yellows are in the lead as Richard talks about using Newton's third law to move a man. So we get to the basketball court as Richard explains the lab rats are cheating because the hoop is so low. So Richard moves the hoop to 30 meters as he wants to make the greatest slam dunk ever. So we get introduced to Jetpack Man as he tries to use his jetpack but it doesn't work and it's very embarrassing. So we get the American in as Richard explains what is going on in the jetpack as he gets ready to show off, but Richard stops the show as he asks the teams whether or not they think the guy will do it. The Reds backs him as we get back to the action. He flies away as he drops the ball in. The crowd cheer as the American flies off, so the Reds get the point as the scores are tied. So the teams get changed for the next round as Richard says Jetpack Man has arrived in the lab. They talk through the footage they just saw. Richard gives him a huge sticker as we get to the mess test, so Richard explains the game as the teams have to shoot prize pods from one end to the other, but one member from the team has to stop the other team in the slime. It's very simple as Richard starts the game, chaos then unfolds as they get to it. They shoot away, the time ends as the red get the most prizes in the end zone. They win the day as Ninja Nan shows off the prizes. Richard then explains the yellow team's prizes have to be blown up as we get to B-Day goes bang. So the Reds are feeling great as the Yellows are disappointed in themselves. They blame Richard for there being too much slime as Richard explains what is going to happen to the toilet as the Yellows blow up their prizes. Richard explains what we learnt today as the episode then ends. Next up we have Season 2 Episode 1. So Richard rushes into the lab as he is fighting off some monster. He gets his coat as he then talks some rubbish. The monster scares him as he welcomes us to the lab. He explains the rules again as we get a preview of what's coming up. Richard introduces us to Ninja Nan once again as she slowly walks in. She shows off again as Richard gets her to move to security. She starts knitting as the yellows walk in as Richard checks who they are. One of them tells a joke as Richard doesn't like it. She then says the longest place in Wales as Richard is then impressed. They come in as we meet the Reds. One of the kids does the worm as Richard lets them in as well. Richard points them to their seats as he talks about Oliver once more. It is the same game as before, so we won't be looking at it in detail. Richard asks the questions as by the end of it the Reds are in the lead by 1 point. So we get to mini science as we meet Mini Miss again. The lights go out as Richard explains it is powered by the water wheel outside, so they get Ninja Nan on the bike as they get the lights back on. Miss Minnie then explains what they are up to today as they are making little rockets and the ones that go furthest wins. Mini Miss explains there is a lot to consider as Richard says it is where the lid lands. Mini Miss does an example in secret as it then explodes. Richard is impressed but scared. The yellows are up first as they get creating their first rocket. They launch the rocket as they score a 6. The Reds have their first go as they only score a 4. Richard then explains the science behind the rocket as the teams have 2 more goes each. They proceed to build and fire the rockets as after the 3 rounds the yellows win the game. The scores are tied as Richard then says they can scale the game up as he talks about tennis as we see some lab rats create a tennis court. They think they can get the fastest tennis serve ever as they do some silly Top Gun parody. The lab rats play a game of tennis as it goes very badly. They call in an expert as we find out he is a spud launcher expert as Richard explains the science behind it. They fire the tennis ball out of the gun as they injure the lab rat. They turn the power up to full blast as Richard then stops the show and asks a question to the teams. Both teams think he will fail as we get back to the action. They don't get the world record so they decide to shoot potatoes through the racket to create a bunch of chips instead. Both teams get points as it is still tied. They go off to get changed as Richard is embarrassed by his lab rats, so makes one take over Ninja Nan on the bike. So we get to the messy mess test as it is a very simple game as the teams have to move the prizes from one end of the pool to the other. The game starts as they go off. The Red are very good as Richard talks over the game. The game then ends as they count up the prizes. The Reds win as Ninja Nan shows off the prizes. They also show off the yellow prizes as they get ready to blow them up. So the team are disappointed in themselves as the team push down the lever and everything explodes. Kaboom! Richard then ends the show as he talks about what we learned throughout the show. Finally we have season 3 episode 7. So Richard and a lab rat are stuck together as suddenly they then unstick and the lab rat flies off. Richard turns to camera and welcomes us to the lab as the crowd cheer. So we get a preview of what is coming up on the show as Richard then introduces Ninja Nan once more. She knocks out the lab rats as we then meet the Red team. One of the kids twists her hands around as Richard is disgusted as he then asks for the password as they shout shampoo. They talk about slipping over shampoo at the swimming pool as we then meet the yellows. One of the kids speaks Dutch as Richard isn't really pleased but he lets them in anyway. They shout the password as Richard is confused on why it is false teeth. They share the silly story behind the password as Richard then introduces Oliver once again. Oliver has had an upgrade with FactNav 2.0. Richard explains what is new as he explains it is the first to 3 this time, and getting one wrong helps the other team, but it is very similar to the first game. So they play out the questions as we hear some surprising facts and some rubbish lies. The audience votes on some questions as well as Richard asks what they think. The Reds win the game as they take the first point. So we get to mini science as Richard talks about his time machine again. Mini Miss says we are playing hide and seek as she explains what the game is about. They have to figure out what floats and what sinks. The team that sinks the most items win. Richard tells a bad joke as the crowd is displeased. So Mini Miss goes over to the teams to give them advice as Richard talks about how the water works and how items sink. Richard comes back over as he asks Yellow for their first item. They try the bin as it slowly sinks. They get a point. The Red tries the can as it floats. I'm shocked, I thought it would have sunk. The Yellows try the whisk as that goes straight down. The Reds come back with the record, it goes down as well. They try the gnome as it floats, so the Reds have to get the last one right to draw. Richard then explains what happened to the gnome. The Reds try the basket but it floats, so they lose the game. The Yellows win again as it is 2-0. Richard then talks about what the lab rats did on the water as we see them in a giant ball. We then see a guy building a scooter thing as Richard can't believe it as he then explains how it works. It's all about bouncing as Richard explains the race rules as they get ready. Richard pauses the clip as he then asks the teams who will win. The Reds go for the ball as we get back into the action. The race begins as the scooter thing flies across the water. He easily wins as the Yellows get the point. So we get to the mess test as it is the same game from the first episode, so we don't need to explain it. The game starts as they fight for their prizes. They shoot away as time then ends. They count up the prizes as the Reds wins. So Ninja Nan shows off the goodies as the Yellows find out what they have to blow up. So we get to B-Day goes bang as the Yellows have to do the walk of shame. They push down on the lever as everything blows up. Richard wraps up the show as he talks about having a nice bath. The episode then ends. In conclusion, Richard Hammond's Blast Lab was a great show. Richard was a great host and it was clear he knew a lot about science. I have always liked Richard's comedy, but there are some points where his comedy falls flat. The science part of the show is very good as each episode taught us new things. Minnie Miss was very helpful as she was the sensible voice when compared to Richard's silliness. Ninja Nan was a silly character and didn't really do anything apart from being a comedy character. But overall it was a good show and I would suggest having a watch if you love science and silly game shows. So thank you for watching. If you have any TV shows you like to see me do, put them in the comments.